is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The world today is at a precipitous point. Conflicts raging in several countries are causing global ripples, negatively affecting the lives of people thousands of miles away. In trying to find lasting solutions to some of these global challenges, Chinese President Xi Jinping has proposed the Global Security and Global Development Initiatives. These initiatives are aimed at fostering global security as a guiding principle, strengthening international cooperation and development, and accelerating the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this week on Talk Africa, we take a closer look at the prevailing global security and economic environment and their effects on Africa. And we ask, how can the two proposed initiatives be implemented to bring about a safer global community with a greater focus on development? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. As part of China's drive to find lasting solutions to global development and security challenges, senior Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi visited Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Now, while in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, he met with heads of state and discussed increasing mutual political trust, strengthening development initiatives and pushing forward bilateral cooperation. The countries also reaffirmed their commitment to the Belt and Road Initiative. The visit comes in the wake of Chinese President Xi Jinping's remarks at the 14th BRICS Summit in June, where he stressed the need to forge an inclusive, high-quality global development partnership and jointly foster a new era of global development featuring benefits for all. The visit to the two African countries affirmed the importance of safeguarding multilateralism, enhancing the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and Africa, and working together to ensure developing countries do not end up as victims of international crisis. Well, joining me now to take a closer look at some of the security challenges the world is facing and unpack the proposed global initiatives are Professor Rana Mitter, Professor of the History and Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford. From Beijing, Enoch Wong, Senior Manager Online Education and International Cooperation, Tsinghua University. And from London, Dr. Frankton Chiyamura, Lecturer in International Development, Development Policy and Practice Group, School of Social Sciences and Global Studies at the Open University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program and thank you for joining in this discussion. I want to get a first assessment from all of you very briefly, because it is fair to say that the world is facing a crisis in the international political, economic and security order with unprecedented challenges to peace and development. First, let me get your assessment of the state of the world today. What current global developments have become major points of concern? Professor Mitter.
The first one is climate change. We hear more or less about this depending on what's in the daily headlines. Sometimes when there are wars, which of course are horrific events which are going to affect many millions of people, we hear less about the long-term effects of climate change. But over time, climate change is clearly the factor which is changing the way in which everything from environment to economics is changing around the world. So that's factor number one. Number two, if we're going to point out things that are happening because of the current global crisis, I would put famine, or at least malnutrition, very much at the heart of what is troubling us. Right now, because in particular of the Russia-Ukraine war, there's a real difficulty with the export of grain to a whole variety of key markets, including in North Africa, for instance. And that is an issue that really must be addressed very, very quickly to prevent mass malnutrition and starvation in many very, very hungry parts of the world. So I give you those two to start with.
Enoch, your thoughts?
I cannot agree more with my colleague there, but I want to take a step back and say COVID-19 really is the big concern. It's spreading human suffering, destabilizing the global economy, and really upending lives of billions of people around the world. The pandemic is an unprecedented wake-up call in some sense, laying bare really deep inequalities and exposing precisely the threat and failures that are addressed in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and, as mentioned, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. So I think it's a great framework, critical framework for COVID-19 recovery that can lead to greener, more inclusive economy and stronger, more resilient society. So in short, I think the biggest threat or concern is a tremendous progress loss for sustainable development goals due to COVID-19. And we can take action now to turn the recovery into real opportunity to do things right for the future.
All right, Dr. Chiyamura.
Perhaps maybe as a way of responding to this, to sort of take a step back and think about, this interesting book which was written by Pascal Lamy and Miko Ernesto on the Strange New World, which tried to capture some of these global uncertainties that we find ourselves in. I'm particularly interested in the conclusion chapter of this book, where they ask, where is the world headed? And I think it does provide a very relevant and useful analysis to help us understand the future in the present. I mean, for one, we know that there are current geoeconomic and geopolitical forces, and to some extent, the way these forces interact with each other, they may have potential outcomes that arguably may be, dangerous or maybe negative to certain people in certain places or spaces. This range from, I think, the compounding effects, which Professor Nita has already spoke about, the climate change, right. The impact of COVID-19. I think in addition to that, the rising cost of living, debt, inflation, energy and food insecurity. And obviously, it goes without saying, the re-emergent conflict in Ukraine and, among others, such as those in Africa, the Horn of Africa to be precise, in Yemen, Sahel, and the Sahel region. So these are all global crises that our generation are facing and definitely affecting the way we interact as civilization.
Dr. Chiyamura, let me stay with you for the moment because you've mentioned geopolitical forces and, creating global uncertainties, and we are not sure where the world is headed. How much of these events are destabilizing the current work order? Would you say there is an emergent new order as a result of the geopolitical forces?
Well, maybe to begin with, there have been these sort of implications that I talk about, these uncertainties, so to say, they are broad, they are catastrophic, and the implications perhaps will have to do with aspects around the commodity markets, supply chains, financial securities at various scales. This could be at an individual, at a regional, national, international, and the most common challenge amongst these is that they impact everyone regardless of location. You could be rich, you could be poor, but I suppose maybe they are more felt by those in the global south. So the question of whether there's a new global order emerging is an interesting one. I think we've had this discussion for quite some time. I think I would say for the past decade or so. Of course, there are signs and symptoms that a new world order is emerging, particularly if you want led by rising powers such as China. And I think there are two sides to this question, really. On the one hand, so we have some analysts saying that the rising powers, if you want, not anyhow different from the traditional powers in the sense that such countries are driven by their own geopolitical and geoeconomic interest.
Right.
But increasingly, I think on the other hand, we have seen that the rising powers have, if you want, developed the means, the capability, as well as the resources to balance out, if not challenge, the dominance of traditional powers, particularly around international norms and practices.
Sorry, let me jump in there, Dr. Chiyamura, and get Enoch's view here. Enoch, in terms of trying to deal with these global uncertainties or all these issues that have been mentioned by the three of you, let's look at what is balancing out here, according to Dr. Chiyamura. Is there credence to suggestions that perhaps there's a new way of dealing with these issues? There is a new order now emerging. What is your view?
Absolutely, I would hope so. I think when we look at the global order or the definition of it, really emerged after the Cold War, and there are a group of countries we call the West that are trying to capitalize on the Cold War dividend, right? They try to maintain their advantages, and by creating this asymmetric and unfair advantage over developing countries. And let me say it's very undemocratic in that sense. But I think there's a new emerging order that are driven by common needs, that are driven by common desire, but not common enemy. Yes, there is diversity. Yes, there's differences, but it's driven by the needs of development. I think there's less about protecting, there's more about progressing. And I think that's what this new emerging order is about.
Right. Dr. Chiyamura, I want to bring this conversation back to where we are today. And, having mentioned all, the areas that the world is struggling to deal with the challenges, where do you see the world headed in terms of coming back to your question of where are we headed?
Well, this is, I think, a very obvious sort of response to this question, in the sense that we all know that if we don't do certain things, where will the world be? I mean, it's clear that if we don't design some policies, or if we don't come up with some frameworks around global governances, then we are headed for disaster. I think maybe try to think around this is this sort of recent proposal which was made by Xi Jinping last year, if I'm not mistaken, at the General Assembly at United Nations, where he sort of started thinking about this idea of global development initiative, and quite recently as well, this idea of global security initiative, which I think for me, obviously maybe the devil is in the details, but I think it's a step in the right direction of trying to come up with some mechanisms that are perhaps inclusive and that have this commonality as sort of the unifying element of it. And obviously, I think it does recognize that the current, if you want, global institutions of governance, they seem to be kind of weak in responding to some of these challenges.
Right. Enoch, let me get your thoughts on what Dr. Chimura has said here, because when you look at who is dealing with what, and clearly the repercussions for international development as a result of the events you've mentioned have been massive over the last 2 years, what is the role here, though, of the multilateral systems in all of this? Are we seeing far much weaker global institutions unable to deal with these global challenges? For example, the United Nations, does it still hold a position it once did in the multilateral world?
I think that there is a desire for multilateral system to play its role. But unfortunately, for example, you mentioned United Nations. I want to use an example which has been on the news quite a lot lately, the NATO. I think it was once, there was once hope that it could be a Western-led world order after the Cold War ended and could make the world safer. But in the past, it really has exposed itself to be anything but what it claims. I think it really is a monstrous 20th century Cold War relic. And it keeps provoking conflict as long as I think it exists, and it continues to break its promise by expanding it eastward. So I think it is a multilateral system that is not doing what it's supposed to, besides the fact that it is a world supreme violator for the UN Charter itself and human rights. But it really doesn't have much respect of the international law, particularly with behavior that created the condition for the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but then we need to set up a system that we can follow the rules by in order for the system to work.
All right, Professor Mita, going by how NATO is behaving in the recent past, though, is this a continuation of the Cold War mentality? What's your view there?
No, actually, what has been happening with NATO is a very strong adaptation in terms of contemporary circumstances. So it's worth noting that, of course, Ukraine, which has been invaded recently by Russia, was not a NATO member. And of course, there's a strong argument that if you're Latvian, if you're Lithuanian, if you're living in the Baltics, then right now NATO membership is one of the things that's protecting you from the possibility of a Russian invasion in turn. So I think you have to sometimes remember history. An awful lot of people who live in Eastern Europe from the 1940s onwards have a strong memory of being invaded by what was then the Soviet Union, as well as by Nazi Germany. And that experience of repeated invasion by authoritarian states is one of the things that's turned people in the direction of wanting some kind of mutual protection. And I think if you're looking for successors to NATO or ways to adapt it, that understanding that small countries, and in China, there's always been this idea, actually a very long time, of understanding the mentality of how small and weak countries need to be protected. Right. That's the motivation, of course, that keeps many people in NATO. So I think one of the things that's really important at the moment is to understand how people see themselves and not simply judge from outside. And that explains a great deal of why so many Europeans value NATO now more than they ever did before.
Enoch, what's your view here? How do you view, the way these multilateral institutions are behaving in this century?
So I think, first of all, I think peace, dialogue, and justice are really the only way out. I don't think any country should be adding fuel and fire and intensifying confrontation. Instead, I think countries should call for ceasefire and end the conflict by supporting Russia and Ukraine in carrying out direct dialogue. I think that's first. Second, Cold War mentality should never, ever be promoted. What I mean by that is that no country should be forced into a friend or foe camp confrontation. We should firmly promote international solidarity and advocate a vision of common, cooperative, comprehensive, and sustainable security, and respect and accommodate legitimate rights for sovereignty and territorial integrity according to the UN. And that's very important, according to what is agreed by the common community, especially, as my colleague mentioned, small and developing countries that we have to protect.
Dr. Chiyamura, Africa tends to get caught in the middle of all these events, even though it is a bystander, in terms of participation. What do you feel here, though? Is there a continuation of a Cold War mentality happening here? I mean, how is Africa navigating itself out of all this?
Yeah, well, the situation in Ukraine is very unfortunate, and I think it does sort of attest to this idea of the world regressing rather than progressing. And I mean, for me, the way I would like to look at it perhaps is to sort of look at the conflict from a vantage point of the impact, particularly in Africa. Recently when the chairperson of the African Union, who is Musa Faki Mahamat, was sort of passing a speech on the Africa Day commemoration, I quote, he said that Africa has become the collateral victim of a distant conflict. That between Russia and Ukraine. So he continues saying, this conflict has upset the fragile global geopolitical and geostrategic balance and is casting a harsh light on the structural fragility of our economies. Indeed, being aware that Russia and Ukraine, they play a very, very big role, particularly around food exports to Africa. And I think the Ukraine-Russia conflict is sort of exacerbating the already existing, fragilities. One of them, obviously, being the effects of COVID pandemic, and again, the climate change, which Professor Mita talked about at the start of this meeting. But worryingly, the rising public debt ratios. And you would know that in Africa at the moment, I think majority of close to, I won't say majority, almost all of African countries are at a stage where they are almost about to reach debt distress. So definitely, these uncertainties are one way or the other affecting African. And indeed, there is need, therefore, for designing some mechanisms and policy intervention that should sort of cushion or, if need be, provide solution to some of these challenges for African countries.
All right, we're going to look at those solutions in just a moment. Dr. Chiyamura, Enoch Wong, and Professor Mita, do stay with us. We're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll take a closer look at the proposed initiatives and how they can be implemented. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Professor Rena Mita, Enoch Wong, and Dr. Frankton Chiyamura. Before the break, we looked at the current state of the global economic and security environment. Let's now look at the proposed initiatives and provide some solutions to global uncertainties. Enoch, I want us to expound on some of the responses to these events that we have just mentioned, and just go back last year at the UN General Assembly, where Chinese President Xi Jinping proposed a global development initiative to steer global development. At the Bo Forum in China in April, President Xi also proposed a new global security initiative. Explain your understanding of these initiatives and why they have become central to China.
My understanding of those initiatives is that it really is an expansion of what President Xi Jinping mentioned about changes that are unseen in a century. There's a recognition that the world is changing. There's a recognition that history might change. There's a generational change that is happening. As guests have mentioned, there's changes in climate and biodiversity. There's geopolitical and conflict that's happening. There's pandemic and global health challenges that's affecting everyone, not just some countries. So therefore, really, upon a very, very successful Belt and Road initiative, there is a proposal of something called the Global Development Initiative, and then later Global Security Initiative. And those two really go hands in hands. It's based on a cooperation and common values of development. And the reason why I think it goes hand in hand is because there's no development unless there's security. And unless there's a security or protection and structure, you cannot really conserve the results of development. So therefore, those two initiatives goes hand in hand to really secure a globalized world order that is driven by supply, industry, and value chain across the whole entire world. Those are initiatives that can help us to address some of the systematic risk that we are facing, whether we are developing or developed country. And last but not least, the 8 areas from the Global Development Initiative and the 6 commitment from the Global Security Initiative, those are things that come out of expertise and experience and consolidation of that. And it's a constant changing and iteration dialogue that has been happening throughout.
Professor Mita, let me rope you in here because there is clearly a need to look at, the security challenges and the development challenges facing the globe today. What's your reaction to what you've heard?
I want to hone in on one and just make clear how central I think it is, and that is security around energy. Because if you don't have energy security, then the economic growth that we've been talking about throughout the entire program simply can't progress. In other words, if we're looking at the emergence, particularly of new and emerging markets, it could be in sub-Saharan Africa, it could be Latin America, it could be Southeast Asia and elsewhere, then that growth is going to have to be real to deal with the economic crisis that the world is in. But it also has to be green. Frankton did mention this briefly, but I want to really drill in on this point. It is going to be absolutely essential to find much, much greener forms of energy if we're not going to succumb to the climate change disaster that is clearly heading towards the world. So fossil fuels, I think it's clear across the world now, are going to have to be out as quickly as possible. But in the meantime, we have to think, first of all, what is the future in the short term we have to say for nuclear energy? And secondly, beyond that, what are the real capabilities of technology that enables us to see a proper renewable and green energy sector? Now, China certainly has a role in that particular story, but it's one that it also has to have and will have, I'm sure, in cooperation with other growing tech powers, including India. I want to mention Turkey, which is often not mentioned very much, but actually is a very important economic actor in its own right and has a role in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in many parts of Asia. And of course, the wider Western world, which has still a tremendous amount to offer in terms of renewables. This is the sort of area where cooperation is not just desirable, it's absolutely essential, and it's at the heart of all the other brilliant goals that my 2 fellow guests have mentioned.
I want to come back to you, Dr. Chiremura, because you did mention about where Africa is going to be when it comes to security and development. And, these geopolitical events are showing that today no country or no continent can face the global challenges alone. And Yang Jiechi, who's a member of the political bureau of the CPC Central Committee, was in Africa this week. China has also recently convened a Horn of Africa Peace and Development Conference. What do you think the underlying message from China is as the world faces these global headwinds, particularly the underlying message for Africa?
In terms of whether this initiative will really contribute to a difference, I think for me it's a bit too early to tell, particularly around, if indeed they will contribute to a more secure and more balanced global development world. But I think based on sort of the previous, based on the assessment, I think of the ongoing or previous Chinese-driven initiatives, the one in the case in point here is the Belt and Road Initiative. I think there's scope and hope for changing the world. And I think, however, the question therefore will be around the exact details and particularly the governing structure around this initiative and how those who perhaps come from a different worldview or from an ideological viewpoint that is different to theirs see this. Is it a threat? Is it an opportunity? And therefore, how will China try to convince those who may have a totally different viewpoint around these initiatives?
All right, Professor Mita, is this a threat? Is this an opportunity? What's your take?
There are very few things in the world that are either simply threats or opportunities. I think what it is more an acknowledgement that the sources of global influence are changing in the world, whether that's economic security, military security, even changes in the way in which global governance are taking part. The whole variety of different actors, including from the global south, are going to have to be included. And I think the most important thing at the moment is to be thinking ahead of time in the way in which the countries which are going to be the major new powers of the next generation. We already have the United States, China, the European Union pretty much sitting at the top table. So the question of who is going to be in the next list of upcoming countries, and South Africa I think is going to be one very good example of how that might emerge. That is the kind of forward thinking that the global order has to do. We sometimes get so caught up with our everyday problems on a day-to-day basis that we don't spend enough time thinking about where the future is going to come. And that will be a really, really important part of any initiative when it comes to international security, to think about what comes next.
And I want to wind up on that note of what comes next. Dr. Chiyamura, I'll start off with you. What kind of security concept do you think the world needs right now? In your view, how can countries achieve that common security and common development?
Well, I think it goes without saying that in each and every conflict situation, if it's a political problem, then you obviously need political solutions to it. If it's another problem driven by maybe economic needs or economic interest, then you should find some solutions that have to do with the cause of that particular conflict. And I think interestingly and increasingly, there is that need therefore to either continue to reform the existing multilateral institutions of governance, but I suspect that there could be an element of resistance, particularly from those traditional development powers who have vested interest in these institutions. But I think equally we also have to think about creating new institutions that, if you want, are responsive and they do understand these different contexts, particularly those coming from the global south. And then the idea therefore is sort of tied to what Enoch said earlier on, that what unifies them is this common need, common desire and common goals, not necessarily common threats or enemies.
All right, Professor Misa, your thoughts?
I think the most useful thought exercise that we can do in the near future as countries and as citizens is to put ourselves in the minds of those who we think are sitting opposite us on the other side. And this is a very useful exercise in national capitals. I'd like to think that people in New Delhi are thinking about what people in Islamabad think, because Pakistan and India are two major countries in the Asia context who often don't spend enough time thinking about what the other thinks. People in Beijing need to be thinking about how things look from the point of view of Washington. People from the point of view of Washington need to understand how the world looks from Beijing. And all of those actors, I think, need to spend a lot more time thinking about the places which are up and coming in the global south, but have still disappeared from the view in the global north. I'd like to have more people thinking about the view from Brasilia, from Lusaka, from Jakarta, from a whole variety of places that are going to be tremendously important 5, 10, 20 years' time, but which even those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about global politics have probably not spent enough time thinking about.
Enoch Wong, you have the final word. What kind of security concept do you think the world needs today, and how can we achieve that common security and common development?
I think the world have to take an approach that we, certain countries are coming there to assist, but not to help. It's not safe yet. It shouldn't come with a top-down approach. I think it shouldn't use their own ways to see the world, as my fellow colleague mentioned. For example, it is very, very important. For example, if China-Africa relationship were to progress, China have always insist to use an African way to build Africa, use the African way to modernize Africa. I think this is very, very important, whether we're talking about security or whether we're talking about development. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so very much for this discussion. But that's all we have time for in this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests, Professor Rana Mita, Professor of the History and Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford, Enoch Wong, Senior Manager, Online Education and International Cooperation, Tsinghua University, and Dr. Frankton Chiyamura, Lecturer in International Development, Development Policy and Practice Group, School of Social Sciences and Global Studies at the Open University. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep this conversation going, and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.